The assignment brief said, "Non-combative escort detail." Mara Solis had read it 3 times before boarding the transit shuttle, trying to convince herself that was a good thing. She had spent 6 years on research stations where the most dangerous thing was a temperamental air recycler or a colleague who didn't clean the shared lab equipment. She was a xenobiologist, not a diplomat, not a field operative, not the kind of person who attracted security details. She had published 11 papers, attended 4 interspecies research symposia, and won 2 mid-tier academic awards that looked nice on her university profile and meant essentially nothing to anyone outside the field. She was not important in the way that warranted protection. Or so she had been telling herself for the 14 days since the threat arrived in her comm, and the telling had gotten considerably less convincing with each repetition. The ICD's escort appeared at Docking Bay 7 at exactly 400 station time, 3 minutes before Mara's shuttle locked. She watched it through the viewport. She corrected herself, though the briefing documents had used no pronoun at all, standing in the center of the bay, absolutely still. Geometric. That was the word that came to her immediately, before she had time to select a more scientific descriptor. He stood the way a shape stands, not the way a person waits. Like something that had been placed there, and had no particular relationship to time. The Vithara were not widely known. They weren't a diplomatic species, weren't trade partners, weren't frequently seen at coalition summits. What Mara knew about them she had mostly learned in a 2-hour window of frantic database searching after the ICD notification dropped into her comm the previous evening. She knew they were old in the way that made human civilization look like a recent geological event. She knew their biology was not biological in any sense her training prepared her for. She knew they communicated through something the xenolinguists called structural resonance, which the databases refused to explain further, as if the concept had given up halfway through the sentence and decided not to embarrass itself. One entry, authored by a researcher named Calloway, contained only the notation, "See direct observation, written analysis insufficient." Calloway's direct observation had never been published. What the databases had not told her was that Koth designation only, no name she could reproduce with human vocal anatomy, would look like this. He was tall, not dramatically, not in the way of species built for intimidation, but tall in the way of something that had simply never been constrained to human proportion. His frame was angular, not bony, that implied a softness of flesh around it, but angular the way a formed object is angular, as if his physical shape had been arrived at through calculation rather than evolution. His skin, if it was skin, was the color of deep space photographed through certain lenses. Not black, not silver, but something between and beneath both, faintly geometric at close range, like the surface of him was organized along invisible lines that the eye couldn't quite follow but the brain kept trying to. He turned toward the viewport when her shuttle entered final docking sequence, and Mara felt something in the air of the bay shift, a change in how the space related to itself, as if the room had been aware of its own dimensions for the first time. She told herself it was atmospheric adjustment. She had a PhD. She dealt in evidence. Dr. Solis, his voice was not a voice exactly, it arrived. Like a waveform rather than a sound, not transmitted through air the way voices were but present in air the way pressure was. Not unpleasant, deeply unfamiliar, the way the first time you hear a language you don't speak. You cannot tell where one word ends and another begins, but you know something is being communicated and the inability is entirely yours. Koth, she said. She had practiced the pronunciation on the shuttle. The first syllable was a front-of-tongue sound that English didn't have a clean equivalent for, and the second dropped in a way that felt like a small controlled fall. She still wasn't sure she had it right. Something in his posture, she was learning to read it already, in the 3 minutes since she'd stepped off the shuttle, suggested he didn't particularly mind. "Your research station," he said, Hellion 9, we depart in 40 minutes. I'm aware of my own schedule. I was not sure, he said without inflection, given that you were late. I was not late. I was watching you through the viewport. That was the 4 minutes before docking. She shouldered her equipment case, which was considerably heavier than anyone who hadn't spent a career in field xenobiology would expect. Then we're fine. He turned and began walking toward the departure gate. She followed and spent the first 30 seconds trying to analyze his gait and failing in a way that bothered her, because analyzing movement was something she was professionally competent at. He moved like a geometric shape moving through space, efficiently, without the small inefficiencies of human walking, without the slight counterbalancing sway she had spent her whole life surrounded by. Like something that had calculated the minimum necessary physics for locomotion and enacted exactly that, with no remainder. The briefing said non-combative escort detail, she said. Yes. That means you're just traveling with me. Yes. For what purpose? Hellion 9 is a deep-field xenobiology station. Nothing happens there. I've been stationed there for 3 years, and the most alarming event was a containment breach in Lab 7 that turned out to be a faulty sensor. He was quiet for 4 steps. Then, you received a threat. Mara stopped walking. She had received a threat 14 days ago. The message had arrived in her professional communications inbox, which was not widely shared, which meant whoever sent it had either performed a degree of research or had access to institutional directories that were not publicly listed. She had reported it to the station's administrative office and to the university consortium that funded her research, and had been told it was probably automated, that research publications sometimes attracted that category of attention, that the sender address traced to an anonymized relay. She had been told she should not be alarmed. What she had not been told, what had apparently happened in the 2 weeks since, was that it had escalated through enough channels to result in ICD involvement. How much do you know about my research? She asked. Everything in the ICD file. And what's in the ICD file? He turned just slightly. The light in the departure corridor caught the surface of him differently when he moved, and for a moment she had the disorienting impression of something vast and ancient folded into an almost manageable shape, like a mathematical figure compressed into 3 dimensions, and the compression showed. Your work on non-carbon biological encoding systems, he said, has implications that several parties would prefer not to be published. She started walking again faster. He matched her pace without adjustment. Which parties? He was quiet again. Not evasive quiet, she was already learning the difference, but processing quiet. The kind of silence that meant the answer was being arranged rather than withheld. The ones that sent the threat, he said at last. And several others who have not yet decided whether to. Mara absorbed this for the length of a corridor. That's extremely comforting, she said flatly. Something changed in the geometric arrangement of his features. It wasn't a smile, she didn't think the Vethara smiled, but it was something that occupied a related conceptual space, like a shape that was adjacent to smiling without being it. No, he agreed. It isn't. The transit vessel was small, built for function over comfort, which Mara had long ago made her peace with across a career of deep space postings. The ICD had booked them into adjacent observation bays, more a courtesy than a necessity, since Koth gave no indication of requiring sleep in the same way she did, and she had spent the first hour of transit reviewing her current research files and trying not to be aware of him in the next bay, which she failed at more than she intended. She tried to sleep at the designated hour. She mostly failed at that too. At some point in the long artificial dark, she got up and went to the forward observation gallery, which was empty at this hour, just a curved viewport of reinforced polymer with 3 billion stars behind it, and the long smear of the Hellion arm stretched across the center of the view like ink drawn slowly across glass. She stood there for 11 minutes, she knew because she'd checked her comm twice, an anxiety habit she'd had since graduate school and never successfully corrected, before she became aware that Koth was also in the room. She hadn't heard him arrive. He made almost no sound when he moved, not the careful silence of someone trying to be quiet, but the native absence of incidental noise that came from a body with nothing incidental about how it occupied space. "You're not sleeping," she said. "I don't require it in the same intervals." She looked at the stars. "Do you find it beautiful, this view?" He was quiet then. "I find it accurate." She turned to look at him. "That's not the same thing." No, he was also looking at the viewport. From this angle, the starlight picked up something in the structure of him, a faint luminescence in the geometric patterns at his temples and along his jaw, like circuit lines that existed just below the surface and occasionally caught the right frequency of light to become visible. But it contains what beauty contains: recognition, the sense of a thing being what it is. She hadn't expected that. She filed it away, the way she filed everything unexpected, into the space in her mind where she kept things that needed further examination. She had a large such space. It had gotten larger in the last several hours. "Your species," she said. "The briefing says you're old." "Yes." "How old?" "In your chronology." He paused, and she had the impression he was doing actual conversion, running a genuine calculation against a timescale not native to him. "We were navigating this region of space before your sun ignited." Mara looked back at the viewport. She did the math quietly by instinct, the way scientists do, not because they need to, but because numbers are their native language and some translations happen automatically. Before our sun, 4.5 billion years, give or take. "So you've watched civilizations rise," she said, "and collapse." "Yes." "That must be," she searched for the word, cycling through several that weren't quite right. "Heavy," she settled on. Another pause. "We don't carry it the way you carry things," he said. "We hold it differently, but yes, there is a weight." She thought about that for a long time. The stars moved past them slowly, not visibly, but she knew they were moving, and the knowledge gave the stillness a depth it wouldn't otherwise have. "Why did you take this assignment?" she asked. "You specifically. The ICD has dozens of species on their escort roster. Why a Vithara and why you?" He turned to look at her then. Full on, in the way he rarely turned, she had already noticed this, that the full-face turn was a significant gesture for him, not used casually. And in the starlight the geometric luminescence was bright enough that she could see it clearly. Lines of soft gold-white running through him in fractal patterns, like living mathematics just beneath the surface, like something you'd find at the edge of a theorem. "Your research," he said, "touches on something my species has studied for 40,000 of your years." She waited. "Non-carbon encoding systems," he said. "The hypothesis that life is not substrate but pattern, that what you call alive is a quality of arrangement, not material." He paused. "We know it to be true. We have known it for a long time. We hoped, when your paper published, that humanity was finally close to knowing it as well." Mara stared at him for a moment in which several things happened simultaneously inside her brain. "You're telling me," she said, "that you have already solved a question I've spent 8 years on." "We've been working on it longer," he said, and she heard something in his voice that she was almost certain was dry humor, quiet and precise as everything else about him. "Then your civilization has existed." She started to say something, stopped. "Can you tell me what you know?" "When you publish your paper," he said, "you will have arrived at most of it independently. I will not compromise that." A pause. "But I find that I am." Another pause, this one longer, as if navigating something with no prior map, "interested in your thinking, if you choose to share it." It was the most halting, careful speech she had heard from him yet, like something enormous and long-established trying to accommodate a new variable. She almost smiled. "You came on this assignment because you wanted to talk about my research." "I came on this assignment," he said with care, "because you were in danger. The research was," a pause, "additional motivation." She looked at him for a long moment. This ancient thing, folded into a shape that stood beside her in the starlight, carrying 40,000 years of knowledge about the exact questions that had kept her awake for 8 of hers. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk." They talked for 4 hours. She had not, in the 8 years of working on the encoding hypothesis, had a conversation partner who could keep pace with her in the technical sections, maintain the conceptual leaps she made between frameworks, and push back productively rather than just asking her to re-explain what she meant. Her colleagues at Hellion 9 were excellent scientists in their own disciplines. Xenobiology was large enough that someone specializing in non-carbon biological encoding systems occupied a niche that most of them followed at a general level, and engaged with specifically only when she forced the topic over shared meals. Koth did not need her to re-explain. He did not follow at a general level. He engaged at a depth that made her recalibrate her understanding of what engagement could look like. And twice, he made a connection between subfields of her own paper that she had not consciously made, and she had stopped walking the observation gallery to write them down before she lost them. At one point, around the 3rd hour, she said, "You're going to cite yourself in the revised paper, aren't you? Anonymized data source." "I had not considered that," he said, in the tone that meant he was considering it now. "You'd be the first unnamed co-author from a species 4 billion years older than the publishing institution." Something in his expression did the thing she had no category for. She added it to the file. Hellion 9 was a mid-sized xenobiology station, 11 decks, rotating on a slow axis to maintain partial gravity in the lab sections, anchored to a minor body in the outer Hellion system that nobody had gotten around to naming yet. The naming committee had been formed twice and dissolved both times when the proposed names became subjects of institutional dispute. Mara had started privately calling the body patients. She had 4 colleagues here. Dr. Yen, atmospheric specialist, relentlessly thorough. Dr. Abuya, geneticist, brilliant and nocturnal and not frequently encountered during standard work hours. Dr. Farwell, senior systems engineer who had been here 11 years and had the specific calm of someone who had resolved all major anxieties and only had minor ones left. And Premi, the lab assistant, 26, first deep space posting, currently in the phase of treating everything as fascinating, which Mara found both refreshing and faintly nostalgic. The station was not designed to have a security threat. It had one external door lock, a single access control at the primary docking bay, which had never been tested under real conditions because there had never been real conditions. "This station has one external door lock," Koth said on the first walkthrough. He was not asking. He was noting, in the way of someone cataloging inadequacies against a standard he had internalized. "It's a research station," Mara said, "not a military installation. The people who sent you the threat will note the same thing." He spent the first day conducting a threat assessment of the kind Mara had never seen done before, because she had never been in a situation that required one. He walked every corridor. He checked every external access point. He reviewed the station's sensor array with Dr. Farwell, who had been dubious and became less so by the 2nd hour. He didn't issue directives. He made observations, and then, with the permission of whoever needed to give it, he made changes. Quietly, methodically, without fanfare. By the end of day 1, Hellion 9 was more secure than it had ever been configured to be, and the configuration changes were elegant enough that Farwell, who had a professional aversion to anything that interfered with his systems, didn't object to a single one. Her colleagues were uncertain about Koth in the early days, which was understandable. Dr. Yen asked too many questions and received patient, minimal answers, and eventually redirected her considerable energy toward an atmospheric analysis she'd been postponing. Dr. Abuya watched Koth move through the station with the specific focused attention of a geneticist encountering a biological structure they didn't have a framework for, and never quite asked what he was thinking but clearly was. Farwell assessed him in the first 5 minutes with the engineer's rapid practical evaluation, useful or not useful, functional or not functional, and landed in a posture of cautious respect that didn't require further revision. Premi asked Koth on day 2 if he was a robot. No, Koth said. Are you made of the same material as a robot? No. Premi squinted with the committed curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to perform a professional disinterest she didn't feel. What are you made of? Koth looked at her steadily for a moment. Pattern, he said. Premi absorbed this. That's a really good answer, she said. I'm going to think about that. He watched her go, and Mara, who had heard the exchange from the other side of the lab partition, saw something in his posture that she was almost certain was fond. The Vethara equivalent of fond, whatever that architecture looked like, but it was in the right territory. She added it to the file. She worked. That was what she did. It was what she had always done, and the presence of a bodyguard in her peripheral vision was not enough to disrupt a habit laid down over 3 years of deep space routine. She ran her assays. She reviewed her models. She argued with herself about the encoding hypothesis in the margins of her digital notebooks, the way she always had writing things she disagreed with in one color, rebuttals in another, questions in a third, until the documents looked like argument had taken physical form and been filed for reference. Koth read them. She noticed because he was always in the lab during her work hours, stationed at the secondary console she'd cleared for him, alert in the Vethara way that looked like stillness but wasn't, and she caught him, on day 3, with her open notebook documents on his access terminal. She could see his eyes moving, not surveillance, reading, the particular quality of someone engaging with an argument. You can ask, she said without looking up. A pause. Your second model, he said, assumes a fixed resonance constant. She did look up. What? In your third hypothesis, the encoding stability model. He turned the terminal toward her slightly, and she saw he had her current working document open, the messy, argumentative, half-finished draft she hadn't shown anyone. You assume the resonance constant is fixed across substrates. It isn't. Mara set down her stylus. How do you know that? He held her gaze with the particular steadiness of someone about to say something that carries weight. Because, he said, I am evidence. The silence stretched long enough to acquire its own properties. You're telling me, she said slowly, that your species is a non-carbon encoding system. We transitioned, he said, a very long time ago. From what you would recognize as biology into what we are, the pattern remained. The substrate changed. He paused. What you are working toward theoretically has already occurred. We are the proof of concept. Mara stared at him. You died and came back as, she searched for the right words, as living mathematics. We didn't die, he said. It wasn't death, not as you understand it. It was rearrangement. The information persisted. The form became something else. His gaze was steady. That is what your paper describes, the theoretical framework for something that has already happened. That is why it is dangerous to certain parties. If a non-carbon pattern can be a person, if personhood is substrate independent, then the legal and ethical frameworks that currently define who counts as a person, who has rights, who can be owned or categorized or excluded, become not just outdated but fraudulent. Mara thought about the threat, the anonymized relay, the 3 factions Koth had mentioned, 2 human and 1 not, united only by a shared interest in her silence. She thought about 11 papers and 2 mid-tier academic awards and the thing that had been building in her notebooks for 8 years. Tell me, she said, about the resonance constant. He looked at her, And this time there was something in that geometric face that she had no category for, something between ancient gravity and something much newer, much closer to the surface. It varies, he said, with proximity to consciousness. Your model treats it as a property of matter. It's actually a property of. The alarm hit before he finished the word. It was not the containment breach alarm, which was the one she knew. She'd heard it 3 times in 3 years, and it had never been an actual containment breach. It was the external access alarm, the one that existed in the station's systems but had never been triggered in the 11 years of Hellion 9 operation, and it was screaming across every speaker in the station, in a frequency that made the emergency lights flicker in sympathy. She was out of her chair before she processed what it meant. Koth was already at the door, moving in that not-human way, the efficient geometry of a body that had calculated the relevant physics, and was executing on the solution while she was still reading the problem. Corridor, he said, not lab now. She followed. She had decided, somewhere in the space between the observation gallery on the transit vessel and 6 days of working alongside him, that when Koth said now, she would move without argument. This was not the instinct she'd expected to develop. She was a scientist. She argued with evidence. She formed her own conclusions. She had once spent 11 months defending a hypothesis she'd been told was wrong and been proven right. But Koth had not been wrong yet, not once, and she had been paying attention. The corridor was empty. Emergency lighting had dropped to tertiary, painting everything in amber-orange, and the alarm was cycling through its warning pattern in the walls. "What is it?" she asked, keeping her voice low because he was keeping his low. "Docking breach," he said, "Bay 2. Unmanned entry vehicle, remote piloted, no crew transponder." He was moving as he spoke, not toward the source of the alarm but perpendicular to it, in a route she recognized after half a corridor as a flanking path she hadn't known the station had. "They're going to the research archive first. That's the primary target." "How do you know?" "Because the threat analysis indicated data retrieval priority. They want to erase it. Not stop publication, erase the underlying research so that publication becomes impossible." He paused at a corridor junction, removed something from his equipment harness, flat and geometric, humming at a frequency she felt in her back teeth rather than her ears, and pressed it to the junction access panel. The panel responded. Lights shifted in the corridor segment ahead. "I've locked them out of the primary data routes. Your archive is isolated to an air-gapped partition. Nothing they carry will reach it." Mara stared at the panel. "You can do that." "My people," he said quietly, "built the foundational architecture that system is derived from. 12,000 years before the engineers who designed this station were born." She absorbed this, and the people who came in. 2 operatives, professional grade. The vehicle registration is contracted, not traceable to any of the 3 factions directly, which means they're careful and they're not improvising. He looked at her, his expression calm in the emergency lighting, the fractal lines in his face visible and steady. "When they verify that the archive is locked, they'll escalate." "To what?" He chose his next words with the particular care of someone who believes in accuracy but understands its weight. "To ensuring that the primary researcher cannot continue the research." Mara heard that clearly. She let it settle for exactly 1 second. "Okay," she said, "what do we do?" He looked at her. "We make them believe the archive has already been destroyed." "Can you do that?" "I can make the station's sensor output show total data loss in the archive sector. Their equipment will read it as genuine. They'll verify the reading before taking further action. It's standard protocol in this category of operation. That buys us the time we need." "Time for what?" "ICD backup response is 12 minutes from our current position." He met her gaze. "And time to ensure they don't find you in the interim." The next 12 minutes were the longest of Mara Solis' professional life. which had included a zero-gravity lab fire, an 18-month research block that she'd broken through at 3 a.m. with a hypothesis she'd written on her arm because she'd run out of surfaces, and the complete systematic rejection of her first major paper by 4 consecutive reviewers who had, she was later told, been working from an outdated framework and knew it. None of those had involved 2 professional operatives moving through her station with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. Koth moved her through the maintenance corridors, service passages built for engineering access, narrow and utilitarian, and almost entirely off the sensor grid. He knew them. She didn't ask how. She was forming a theory about what 40,000 years of accumulated pattern knowledge looked like when expressed through a consciousness that had walked more stations and ships and structures than she had vocabulary to number. She could hear them. Twice she heard footsteps in adjacent corridors, human footsteps, recognizable by rhythm, by the slight variability of human gait that no professional training quite eliminated. Once she heard a voice, low and professional, checking in through comms. She couldn't make out the words. She understood the tone, operational, calm, recalibrating. They were getting closer to the archive sector. Koth's hand found her arm in the dark. He stopped her with one touch and held still. She held still. 30 seconds in which the footsteps on the other side of the partition paused, moved, paused again. A subdued calm exchange. Then the footsteps moved away, toward the archive sector, she thought, toward the sensor reading that would show them what they'd come to confirm. She let out a breath she had been holding. Koth's hand didn't release immediately. It held not tight, not urgent, just present, and she was aware of it in the heightened awareness way of someone running at full alertness, aware of the weight and the temperature and the geometry of it, which was not quite like a human hand, but was holding her arm with the same careful steadiness as one. Then it released, and they moved again. The secondary command station was a small room off the main operations corridor, used primarily for backup communications during maintenance windows. It had a reinforced door lock that Koth engaged, a single communications console, and a viewport that looked out to the anchor body they'd been calling patience, dark and silent in the outer dark. Mara sent the ICD contact signal. Koth stood at the door with his back to her, watching the corridor through the reinforced glass, and she spent the 3 seconds waiting for confirmation, studying him in the emergency lighting. The angular frame, the geometry of his posture, the fractal luminescence at his temples and jaw that was distinctly brighter now, running at higher output the way certain systems run hotter under load. "Koth," she said quietly. He turned slightly, a quarter turn, the one that meant he was listening without breaking his observation of the corridor. "The resonance constant," she said, "before the alarm went off, you were about to tell me what it's a property of." She asked it now here, in the amber light of a locked room with 2 professionals somewhere in the station working toward her. She asked because 8 years of research instinct had a single overriding directive: ask the question when you have the chance. You never know when the next one will come. He was quiet for a moment that contained several things. "Relationship," he said. She waited. The resonance constant, the stability of a non-material encoding system, varies with the quality of its relationship to other conscious things. He kept his eyes on the corridor, to other patterns. We didn't fully understand this for the first several thousand years. We thought it was an intrinsic property of the pattern itself. It isn't. The pattern is stabilized by. He paused again, and this time she had the impression of something very old trying to find language for something it had known so long it predated its own vocabulary for it. "Connection," he said. "Conscious connection. The anchor isn't internal, it's relational." Mara was very quiet. "That's what stabilizes you," she said. "Yes." "Then when you're alone, without connection." "It doesn't break," he said. "We don't dissolve from isolation, but a pause. It diminishes over long timescales without anchor." She heard what was behind that. She was a scientist. She specialized in pattern recognition, and patterns were visible in many more systems than biology. "You've been alone for a long time," she said. The pause before he answered was the longest she had measured from him. "The Vethara," he said finally, "do not frequently form connections with species of shorter duration. The loss becomes—" He stopped. "Heavy," she said. He turned to look at her fully. In the emergency lighting, with the alarm having finally cycled to silence, the fractal lines in his face were bright and clear, and his expression was the one she had been filing away for 6 days in the section of her mind she kept for things requiring further examination. The ICD response signal hit her comm, and the station shook once with the docking of a larger vessel, and the next 14 minutes were procedural and loud and full of other people. The operatives were removed in restraints. The station was swept in sections, cleared, and a preliminary security report was filed. Commander Brecht, ICD response team lead, 20 years in, efficient as a well-calibrated instrument, worked through her debrief checklist in the main lab with the thoroughness of someone who had learned from experience that thoroughness was never wasted. Dr. Yen was located in the atmospheric monitoring room, where she had spent the incident composing an incident report of impressive detail, and had filled 5 pages by the time she was found. She was unhurt, indignant at having been frightened, and extremely professional about both. Dr. Abuya had slept through the first 6 minutes of the alarm, having worked through the previous night on a genetic sequencing project, and was aggrieved at the excitement he'd missed and the interruption to the sequencing. In that order. Farwell had pulled the station systems into manual override and sat on them for the duration, and was the calmest person Mara had spoken to since the alarm went off. Premi had, with considerable presence of mind, locked herself in the specimen archive and used the time to label 47 samples that had been awaiting processing, because she had decided that being productive was better than being frightened, and the labels were extremely well done. Mara sat in the main lab while the ICD response team finished their walkthrough, and watched Koth give his debrief to Commander Brecht. She watched how he described the sensor spoof, the archive isolation, the route choices, all of it delivered in the same even, measured cadence as everything else he said, without drama, without any narrative architecture that put him at the center of the story. "Good call on the sensor spoof," Brecht said when he finished. "That bought the critical window." "It was the available option," Koth said. Brecht looked at him for a moment with the slight narrowing of eyes that Mara had come to recognize as humans recalibrating, taking in new information and updating the model they'd arrived with. "How'd you know the archive was the primary target?" "That wasn't in the threat analysis we received." A pause. "I read the research," Koth said. "Then I understood what it was worth." Brecht nodded slowly and moved to her next debrief, and Mara looked at the surface of the secondary console and thought, "Oh, that's what that is." She found him on the outer observation deck at the end of the station's rotation arm, a narrow platform that existed officially for hull maintenance access, but had, in practice, the best deep space viewport on the station. Nobody used it socially because it required a manual airlock cycle, and the floor had a texture that was technically non-slip but felt uncertain in practice. Mara had discovered it in her first month and had never told her colleagues, and apparently Koth had found it by other means. He heard her coming through the airlock cycle. He didn't turn. She stood beside him and looked at the stars. "Your paper will need revision," he said after a moment. "Yes. The resonance constant section specifically." "I know," she paused. "You're going to help me get the right value." "I can provide data points." She looked at him sideways. 40,000 years of data points. "More," he said, "if you count the period before the transition." She breathed in slowly. The stars beyond the viewport at this distance from the Hellion body, no atmospheric scatter, no light pollution, no anything between the viewport and the deep field were extraordinary. Dense and architectural, like the visible structure of something too large to see all at once. The factions that sent the operatives, she said. They wanted the research destroyed because it redefines personhood. Yes. If a pattern is a person regardless of substrate, she stopped, made herself continue. Then the legal and ethical frameworks that currently define who counts as a person, as property, as a category of being with rights become inadequate. Fraudulent, he said more precisely. And that's inconvenient for a lot of existing structures. Extremely. She considered that for a moment. 8 years of work, the shape of what it meant. It's going to be a long fight, she said. Yes, a pause. The paper should be published anyway. She turned to look at him. You don't have a stake in this the way I do. Your species has already been through this. He turned to look at her, fully. The full-faced turn he reserved for the things that mattered, and the starlight did the thing it did to him, picking up the fractal luminescence, the gold-white geometry of a consciousness she was only beginning to have the mathematics for. His expression was the one she had no category for, and had finally, in the last hour, developed a hypothesis about. My species has already been through this, he said. We arrived where you are now with no one who understood the question. We had the answer before we had the language for it. We made the transition before we had the framework for what we were becoming. He paused. The cost of that was, he stopped. She waited. We lost people, he said, patterns, who could not be stabilized because there was no one who understood what they were, who could not anchor because the concept of anchor didn't exist yet. He was quiet for a moment. If your paper exists, the humans who come after you, who are, in ways your current science is only beginning to acknowledge, much closer to what we are than your biology suggests, will have someone who understood the question first, who built the framework before it was needed. Mara was quiet for a long time. Outside the viewport, the Hellion arm spread across the dark in its long, patient arc, and she thought about what it meant to be the person who built the framework before it was needed. The person who asked the question clearly enough that the next person didn't have to start from silence. The resonance constant, she said, stabilized by relationship. Yes. Then what happened to you, after the transition, if the Vethara don't connect with shorter duration species? We connect with each other, he said, we endure. But it diminishes. Slowly, over timescales your civilization currently doesn't span. She held that for a moment, and yet you're here, she said. He looked at her. The stars moved slowly in the viewport behind him, the station's long rotation carrying the view through its arc, and the fractal lines in his face were bright and clear and present. And yet I'm here, he said. Mara had a rule about hypotheses. Form them carefully, test them with evidence, report the results accurately regardless of what you hoped they would show. It was the bedrock of her work, the thing she was least willing to compromise on, the principle she had defended in 4 consecutive peer reviews and 11 years of academic argument. She also knew, as a practical matter, that some things required you to act on the data you had before you could run a full test, that some questions could only be answered by asking them. The paper is going to take another 6 months to revise properly, she said, especially the resonance section. I estimated the same. You'd have to stay. A pause that had several things in it. Then, the ICD assignment was indefinite, pending full resolution of the threat assessment. The operatives have been removed. The threat assessment is not, he said carefully, fully resolved. The 3 factions still exist. The conditions that produce the threat have not changed. Another pause. It would be professionally irresponsible to conclude the assignment prematurely. She almost smiled. Professionally irresponsible. Yes. I see, she looked back at the stars, so you'll stay. As long as the assignment requires. She nodded slowly. The rotation carried the viewport through another arc and the great deep field shifted and resettled. She had lived in this view for 3 years. She had come to it in the early hours when the station was quiet and her notebooks were full of argument, and it had given her the same thing every time, the sense of a thing being what it is, accurate, containing what beauty contains. She understood it now the way she hadn't in the first 3 years. She understood what it felt like to be in the presence of something that had been what it is for longer than she had adequate units to measure, and to find it looking back. "I want to ask you something," she said. He waited. "You said the resonance constant varies with relationship, with conscious connection." She paused. "Is it directional? Does the stabilization only go one way from the more complex or older pattern to the simpler or newer one? Or?" "Mutual," he said, and something in his voice was quieter than the rest of the conversation had been, more careful, more like something being said for the first time rather than explained. "The stabilization is mutual. A pattern cannot serve as anchor without being anchored in return." Mara nodded slowly, processing that, running it through the model, finding that it fit. "My hypothesis," she said, "is that you are currently experiencing something, in terms of the resonance, in terms of the quality that stabilizes the pattern." He was quiet for a long time. "Is my hypothesis correct?" she asked. The luminescence in his face was bright. "Dr. Solis," he said, and his voice was doing something she'd never heard it do, something that sounded like the noise careful things make when they first allow themselves to be less than careful. "Your hypotheses," he said, "have thus far been remarkably accurate." She smiled. She couldn't help it and she didn't try. 8 years of a question, and the answer was standing next to her in the starlight, 40,000 years old and apparently, despite all reasonable expectation, still capable of encountering something new. "Mara," she said, "if we're going to revise this paper together, you should probably call me Mara." He was quiet for one more moment, and then something happened in the geometry of his expression that she had no single word for and had stopped needing one, because she recognized it entirely. She had been recognizing it for days. She had simply been waiting until she was sure enough to say so, which was how she operated, and which, she suspected, was how he operated too. "Mara," he said. "Koth," she said. The station rotated on its long axis, and the stars wheeled through the viewport in their ancient arc, and two conscious things, one old enough to have watched civilizations she had only read about rise and fall and be forgotten, one carrying 8 years of a question that turned out to have been the right question, stood in the starlight and began, carefully, to compare notes. The paper took 7 months in the end, not 6. Research always did. The resonance constant required 4 complete recalculations, because the first 3 had variable errors that only revealed themselves when Mara ran the full model against Koth's historical data, 40,000 years of observation, logged in a format that predated every data standard she was familiar with, which Koth translated with the patient precision of someone who had been converting between incompatible systems since, before her species had developed the concept of compatibility. Premi became, unofficially and then officially, the paper's research assistant. She had the instincts for it, meticulous, curious, genuinely interested in the question rather than the publication, and she had also, at some point in the 7th week, quietly stopped treating Koth as something to observe and started treating him as someone to talk to, with the natural ease of someone young enough not to have yet accumulated the categories that made that difficult. He answered her questions, all of them, with the same patient precision he brought to everything else. Mara watched this and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for, and then found one. It was the feeling of watching connection become easier, of watching the distance that species and history and category put between things start to yield to something more practical. She filed it away. She had a large file now. She was starting to think it might become a second paper. 6 months after the operatives were removed from Hellion 9, and 3 weeks before the paper submitted to the Journal of Interspecies Biological Systems, Mara found Koth in the outer observation deck. She found him there most evenings now. It had become, without announcement or agreement, in the organic way of things that establish themselves, the place where they talked, not about the paper, about other things. About what the Vethara had learned in 40,000 years of navigation, about what she'd noticed in the years before Hellion 9 that she hadn't had language for yet, about the anchor body they were still calling patience, about what consciousness felt like from the inside when the inside was as old as his was. He asked her once what it felt like from the inside when the inside was as new as hers. She thought about it for longer than she usually took to answer things. Like being in the middle of a sentence, she said, and knowing there's more of it but not yet knowing how it ends. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is the most accurate description of biological consciousness I have encountered in 40,000 years of study. I'm telling my department head," she said. "That's going on my academic record." Something in his expression did the thing she loved. The paper was published on a Tuesday. The title was Non-Carbon Encoding Systems and the Relational Basis of Pattern Stability, a Framework for Expanded Personhood Definitions in Xenobiology. The author line read, Dr. Mara Solis, Hellion 9 Xenobiology Station. The acknowledgments read, in part, the author is indebted to an unnamed colleague whose contribution to the theoretical foundations of this work cannot be adequately quantified, and whose patience with the process of scientific revision proved considerably more stable than initially expected. The author further acknowledges that the most significant breakthroughs in this work occurred in conversation, which is, as the paper itself concludes, precisely the point. 3 of the existing power structures that found the paper inconvenient contested it through official channels. 2 revised their frameworks within 18 months. The 3rd commissioned a counter-study that concluded, 5 years later, substantially the same thing, under a different title, which Mara found deeply satisfying in a way she made no effort to conceal. The resonance constant, once they had it right, was elegant. She hadn't been surprised. The most important things usually were, once you'd done the work of finding them. On the day the paper went live, she found Koth in the outer observation deck in the early evening, as she usually did, and she stood beside him in the dark with the stars beyond the viewport and the slow, certain hum of the rotation under their feet. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at the stars for a moment. "Are you going to tell me you have to leave now? The assignment concluded, the threat resolved, professionally responsible to withdraw." He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. The luminescence was steady, warm and geometric and present, the gold-white lines running through the fractal patterns in his face in the specific way she had come to know the way she knew the sound of the station's rotation, and the smell of the lab and the texture of a night cycle on Hellion 9. The particular, irreplaceable way of a specific thing, not a category of thing. "The ICD," he said, "has noted that the 3 factions still exist." "They have," she agreed. "It would therefore be professionally irresponsible." She laughed. The sound of it moved through the observation deck and into the dark beyond the viewport, and something in the geometry of his expression did the thing she still had no single word for and had long since stopped needing one. "Professionally irresponsible," she said. "Yes, absolutely. Very important that you stay." He looked at her full on, the way that meant it mattered, and the stars moved slowly in the deep field behind him, and he said her name. "Mara." "Koth," she said. Outside the viewport, the Hellion arm spread its long, patient light across the dark, and the station rotated on its ancient axis, and the anchor body they had been calling patience held still and silent as it always had. The pattern held. The resonance was stable. And 2 conscious things, in the specific and mutual and relational way of such things. One carrying 40,000 years and one carrying 8 years of the same question, both having found in the other the proof that the answer was worth the asking, continued to anchor each other through the long and necessary dark. The next paper, she had already decided, would be about that. The revision process had a rhythm she hadn't expected. Mara had revised papers before, all 11 of them, and the process had always been a negotiation between what she'd written and what the reviewers wanted, with the evidence serving as the only reliable arbiter. She was good at it. She was patient and precise, and had the specific stubbornness of someone who had learned early that being right required more than being correct. Revising with Koth was different. He read everything. Not just the sections he'd contributed data for, not just the theoretical sections where his experience was most directly relevant, but everything. The methodology, the literature review, the tables, the appendices that most human reviewers skimmed. He read with the attention of someone for whom attention was not a resource to be rationed but a native state. And when he had a comment, he made it precisely, without preamble, in the middle of lab sessions or evening conversations, or once, memorably, at 2 a.m. when she'd gotten up for water and found him in the lab with her current draft on 3 screens simultaneously. "The methodology section," he said, when she appeared in the doorway, "understates the implications in section 4. She looked at him. She looked at the 3 screens. She got her water. "It's 2 in the morning. I don't require sleep in the same intervals," he said, which she knew, and which did not explain why he was revising her methodology section at 2 a.m., and which she understood anyway. She sat down at the adjacent console. "Show me section 4. They worked until 5 a.m. She went asleep for 2 hours and came back. He was still there. "You should eat something," he said when she appeared. She stopped walking. "You're monitoring my meal schedule now. You've eaten twice in the last 32 hours. "That's not," she counted backward. "That's probably accurate." She looked at him. "You've been counting." "I notice things," he said, in the tone that was as close as he got to defensive, which was not very close but was enough. She went to the station's galley, ate something that qualified as a meal if she was being generous, and brought something back for Premi, who had arrived in the lab in the interim and was currently running 3 verification calculations simultaneously, with the focused energy of someone who had discovered that she was good at something and intended to stay good at it. "Is he always like this?" Premi asked, nodding toward Koth, who was back at his screens. "I've only known him for 2 months, Mara said. "Is he like this with everyone?" Mara looked at him. The fractal lines were dim in the station's work cycle lighting, running their quiet background hum beneath the surface of him, and he was reading her methodology section with the kind of attention that made the space around the thing being read feel more significant. "I don't know," she said. "I think this might be specific." Premi looked at her. Premi was 26 and perceptive in the way of someone who had not yet learned to manage perceptiveness for social comfort. "That's very good," she said, and went back to her calculations. There was a moment in the 5th month of revision when Mara almost stopped. Not the paper was going to exist, that was not a question anymore. But there was an afternoon in the middle of a particularly difficult section, where the model kept returning a value that didn't fit and she couldn't find the error, and she had been staring at the same 3 lines of code for 4 hours, and the error was somewhere in the resonance constant calculation, and she was so tired of looking at it that she sat back in her chair and said, to no one in particular, "I don't know if this is going to be enough, even if we get it right. I don't know if one paper is going to be enough to change anything." The lab was quiet. Premi had gone to dinner. Farwell was running a systems check on Deck 8. Koth was at his usual console, and she hadn't been saying it to him. Exactly. She'd been saying it to the room, to the problem, to the 8 years of notebooks stacked metaphorically in her mind. But he heard it. When we transitioned, he said, without looking up from the screen, there was a Vithara named something that doesn't translate into your phonology, who spent 300 of your years building the theoretical framework that made the transition survivable for those who came after. He paused. She did not survive to see most of the results. She built it anyway. Mara looked at him. The paper, he said, is not the end of the argument, it's the beginning of the language. The ones who come after you will use it to say things you haven't thought of yet. He looked at her then. That's what it means to build the framework first. She was quiet for a long moment. 300 years, she said. She was thorough, he said, and something in his voice was so dry that she laughed despite everything, and the laughter moved through the lab and broke the stuck quality of the afternoon, and she found the error in the resonance constant calculation 20 minutes later, which was a coincidence she chose not to examine too carefully. There was something else she noticed over the 7 months. The luminescence in him was different here than it had been on the transit vessel, or in the early days on the station. Not stronger exactly, she didn't have the instruments to measure it, and she was not sure instruments would be the right tool anyway. Different in quality. The way a sound is different when it's made in a space that fits it compared to one that doesn't. She mentioned it once, sideways, in the outer observation deck, in the way she sometimes mentioned things she had been thinking about and wanted to test aloud. You're different here, she said, than you were at the start. He was quiet for a moment. In what way? She gestured toward him, toward the fractal patterns. The luminescence, it's changed. He was quiet for longer. Yes, he said. Is that, she paused, is that the resonance constant, the stabilization? Yes, he said again. And then, after a pause, you're different too. She looked at him. I don't have a luminescence. No, he said, but there are other indicators. Such as? He looked at her steadily. You check your comm less often than you did in the first week, he said. The anxiety habit you mentioned. You sleep more consistently. You argue with your notebooks differently, less correcting, more building. He paused. You seem more like what you are, less like what you're worried you might not be. Myra was quiet for a very long time. 40,000 years, she said finally, of observing conscious things. More, he said, if you count the period before the transition. And you think that's the resonance, she said. What you're describing in me. I think, he said carefully, that stabilization looks different in biological systems than in pattern-based ones. The indicators are different, but the mechanism is the same. He looked at her. The anchor functions both ways. I said as much. She nodded slowly. She had filed that. She had been examining it carefully for several months. Koth, she said. Mara, he said, in the tone that she had learned meant he knew what she was going to say and was waiting for her to find the right way to say it. I want to add a section, she said, to the paper, about what stabilization looks like in biological systems, the behavioral markers, what it produces in the pattern that's being anchored. She paused. I have data, 7 months of it. He was quiet. I'm going to need your help with that section, she said. Yes, he said, and his voice was doing the thing again, the quieter, less careful thing, the sound of something that had been waiting to not have to be careful and had found the right moment. Then you'll need to stay, she said, for the revision. The ICD, he said, has noted. The 3 factions, she said, I know. Yes, he said. Good, she said. And they stood in the outer observation deck in the deep field dark, and the stars were what they always were, and the station rotated on its long axis, and the paper that was going to change things, not all at once, not easily, but genuinely and permanently, grew 1 section longer.